Hi guys, so today we will be discussing chapter 12, the heart. The heart is just part of the cardiovascular system, mainly composed of heart, blood vessels, and the blood. So as we have known in our previous chapter, the heart is a muscular organ that is essential for pumping blood throughout the body. So the heart of a healthy adult can pump blood approximately 5 liters per minute. For most people, the heart continues to pump at approximately that rate, which is 5 liters, more than 75 years. So the heart is actually two pumps in one. So what are those pumps? The pulmonary circulation and the systematic circulation. So when we say pulmonary circulation, there are two organs involved, which is the lungs and the heart. So with the heart's right side pumping blood to the lungs and back to the left side of the heart through the vessels of the pulmonary circulation. So this is where your heart is oxygenated. This is where your blood gathers oxygen from your lungs and it will then soon deliver that oxygen throughout your tissues all over the body. Next is the systemic circulation. So there are two organs involved, which is your heart and the tissues all over the body. So what really happens in systemic is the left side of the heart pumps blood to all other tissues of the body and back to the right side of the heart through the vessels of the systemic circulation. So this is where your blood become deoxygenated because the oxygen which is gathered a while ago to your lungs is used by the tissues in their metabolism. So what are the functions of the heart? First is generating blood pressure. Blood pressure is generated by means of contraction of the heart, which forces the blood through the blood vessels. Next is routing blood. So the heart separates the pulmonary and the systemic circulation. We don't want to mix them up. We don't want to mix the used blood and the blood that will be used by our tissue. Next is ensuring the one blood flow. So the valves of the heart ensure a one-way flow of blood through the heart and blood vessels. So we avoid bifurcation or the backflow of blood to where it came from. Lastly is that it regulates the blood supply. So changes in the rate and force of the heart contraction match blood flow to the changing of the metabolic needs of the tissue, most especially during rest, exercise, and a change in body position. So what are the characteristics of the heart? So the size of a fist and it weighs less than 1 pound. The location is found in the mediastinum. So what is mediastinum? It is a midline partition that forms the heart, the trachea, esophagus, and the associated structure. It is found between the lungs and in the thoracic cavity. So the orientation of the heart, we have what we call an apex, which is the pointed area at the bottom, and a base, which is the superior area of your heart. So the heart, similar to other muscles of the body, like that of skeletal muscle, is consists of membranous layer or covering. In heart, we call it the pericardium. Pericardium of the heart is divided into two, which is the fibrous pericardium and the serous pericardium. The fibrous pericardium is the outer layer, which is tough, fibrous connective tissue, while the serous pericardium is the inner layer consisting of flat epithelial cell, mostly simple squamous epithelium, and is divided into two, which is the parietal and the visceral pericardium. The parietal pericardium is the part lining the fibrous pericardium, whereas the part covering the heart surface is the visceral pericardium or the epicardium. The space around the heart is called the pericardial cavity that contains the pericardial fluid. It is divided into four chambers, two atria and two ventricles. Outside these four chambers, we have the heart's external anatomy. So it is divided into three, which is the coronary sulcus, the anterior interventricular sulcus, and the posterior interventricular sulcus. So the coronary sulcus extends around the heart, separating the atria or the upper portion of the heart and the ventricle, which is the lower portion of the heart. The anterior interventricular sulcus extends inferiorly from the coronary sulcus on the anterior surface of the heart, while the posterior interventricular sulcus extends inferiorly from the coronary sulcus on the posterior surface of the heart, meaning the anterior interventricular sulcus can be seen in front or the anterior portion of the heart from the coronary sulcus, and the posterior can be found in the back or the inferior portion of the heart from the coronary sulcus. We have six large veins that carries blood to the atria of the heart: the superior and inferior vena cava, the pulmonary veins, pulmonary arteries, pulmonary trunk, aorta, and the two arteries that is often called the great vessel or the great artery. The superior and inferior vena cava carries blood from the body to the right atrium, meaning the superior vena cava carries the used or deoxygenated blood from the upper body, and the inferior vena cava carried the deoxygenated blood or the used blood from the lower body. The pulmonary veins carries blood from the lungs to the left atrium, while the great vessels or great arteries carries blood away from the ventricles of the heart. The pulmonary trunk arising from the right ventricle splits into the right and left pulmonary arteries, which carries blood to the lungs, while the aorta arising from the left ventricle carries blood to the rest of the body. Here is a review of the gross anatomy of the heart. Again, we have four chambers: the left atrium, the right atrium, the left ventricle, and the right ventricle. The coronary sulcus separates atria, the upper part, from the lower part, which is the ventricle. We should know these basic structures and parts so that we will know how the blood works, how the blood flow inside our heart, as well as the flow of the action potential inside. The atria is the superior chamber of the heart or the upper portion of the heart. It is also the holding chamber that is small and thin-walled that contract minimally to push the blood into the ventricles. So the left and right atria is divided by an interatrial septum, while the ventricles is the inferior chamber or the lower portion of the heart near to the apex. It is a pumping chamber. It is thick and strong walled so it can pump harder and forcefully because its supply or the contraction of it is responsible in propelling the blood out of the heart. So the left and right ventricles is divided by interventricular septum similar to the atria. As I have said a while ago, the heart has a one-way flow of blood. This is to avoid backflow or what we call bifurcation. So this is maintained by what we call a valve. The valve separates from the right atria to your right ventricle, and similarly it separates your left atria to your left ventricle. So we have two valves: the tricuspid valve or the bicuspid valve, also called your mitral valve. So the tricuspid valve, the atrioventricular valve that separates your right atrium and your right ventricle is called your tricuspid valve. It has three cusps, and the atrioventricular valve that separates your left atrium to your left ventricle is called the bicuspid valve or your mitral valve. It has two cusps. So what is the action of these valves? So we have the papillary muscles, which is a cone-shaped muscular pillar, and a chordae tendineae, which is a connective tissue that attaches these muscles to the free margin of the cusp. So when the ventricle contract, the papillary muscle contract and prevent the valves from opening again into the atria by pulling on the chordae tendineae attached to the valve cusp. Similar to the atrioventricular valve, we also have the semilunar heart valves, which is a three-half-moon shaped cusp and are valves between the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Specifically, the valve between right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk is called the pulmonary valve, while the valve between the left ventricle and the aorta is the aortic valve. A cardiac skeleton is a plate of connective tissue or fibrous skeleton consists mainly of fibrous rings that surround the atrioventricular and semilunar valves and give them a solid support. So this connective tissue plate also serves as electrical insulation between the atria and the ventricles and provide a rigid attachment site for cardiac muscle. Here is a very important highlight of this topic. So, blood flow through the heart. So, we will discuss how the blood flow from the outside to the inside of your heart, how the blood became oxygenated and became deoxygenated. So, first, the blood will enter the right atrium from the systemic circulation through the superior and inferior vena cava. Do note that this blood is from systemic circulation, meaning the blood is deoxygenated because the oxygen is already consumed by the tissues. The right atrium will contract enough to open the tricuspid valve so that the blood will enter the ventricle. The ventricle is in the current state of relaxation. Following right atrial contraction, the right ventricle begins to contract. This contraction pushes blood against the tricuspid valve, forcing it to close. This is the first sound that you will hear in your heart. When the pressure in the right ventricle increases, it is enough to open the pulmonary semilunar valve. As the right ventricle relaxes, its pressure falls rapidly and the pressure in the pulmonary trunk becomes greater than in the right ventricle. The backflow of blood forces the pulmonary semilunar valve to close. The pulmonary trunk branches to form the right and left pulmonary arteries, which carry blood to the lungs where the carbon dioxide is released and the oxygen is picked up. So this is where your blood becomes oxygenated. The oxygenated blood will then be carried by your pulmonary veins to your heart. Pulmonary veins are the only veins in the body that carry an oxygen-rich blood because veins should be carrying the oxygenated blood and arteries should be carrying the fresh blood or the oxygenated blood. So again, the blood returning from the lungs, which is the oxygenated blood, enters the left atrium through the four pulmonary veins. So most of the blood flowing into the left atrium passes into the left ventricle while the left ventricle relaxes following the previous contraction. Before the end of the ventricular relaxation, the left atrium contracts and enough blood is pushed from the left atrium into the left ventricle to complete the left ventricular filling. Similar to what happened to your right ventricle, the left ventricle begins to contract and the contraction pushes blood against the bicuspid valve, forcing it to close. The bicuspid valve is the valve in between your left ventricle and your aorta. Blood flowing through the aorta is distributed to all parts of the body except to those parts of the lungs supplied by the pulmonary blood vessel. This blood is oxygenated blood and will be used by the whole body tissue enabled for their metabolism to continue. So this is how the blood flows through your heart. First is the deoxygenated blood from your tissue will go through your superior and inferior vena cava to your right atrium, to your tricuspid valve, then right ventricle, then pulmonary semilunar valve, then pulmonary trunk, and then pulmonary arteries to the lungs, where the blood is oxygenated. It will then go back to your heart via your pulmonary veins, and then the left atrium, bicuspid valve, left ventricle, aortic semilunar valve, and your aorta through your body where the oxygenated blood will be used. The heart wall is divided into three, the epicardium or the visceral pericardium, the myocardium or the thick middle layer that is composed of cardiac muscle, and the endocardium which is the inner surface and is very smooth. As discussed on chapter 3, cardiac muscle is very different from skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle has one centrally located nucleus. It has a branching cell and is very rich in mitochondria as it needs a continuous supply of ATP or energy enabled for the action potential to be continuously flowing in its muscle. So it is striated and it contains actin, and myosin, the contractile unit similar to that of the skeletal muscle. It has calcium and ATP for contraction, and it has an intercalated disc that connects the cell. This intercalated disc has a gap junction where the cell can easily communicate. Similar to skeletal muscle, the cardiac muscle has also changes in membrane channels permeability that is responsible for producing action potential. In cardiac muscle, or in heart, it is called pacemaker potential. So similar to the skeletal muscle, it has depolarization, repolarization. Similar to the skeletal muscle, the cardiac muscle has a depolarization and repolarization. The difference is that cardiac muscle has a plateau phase. So what is a plateau phase? Like action potential in skeletal muscle and neurons, those in cardiac muscle exhibit depolarization followed by a repolarization. But in cardiac muscle, however, it has a period of slow repolarization that greatly prolongs the action potential. In contrast to the action potential in skeletal muscle, which takes less than 2 milliseconds to complete, action potential in the cardiac muscle takes approximately 200 to 500 milliseconds to complete. This plateau phase is due to the calcium channels that remains open. Here is the difference of the action potential in the skeletal muscle and the cardiac muscle. As you can see, in the skeletal muscle has no calcium channel that is being opened, unlike that of the cardiac muscle. An addition of the calcium channel being opened, it causes a huge difference in the inside and outside charges of the cell. This causes the slow repolarization of the cardiac muscle. So how does the conduction system of the heart work? So what is the conduction system? This is how the action potential flow inside the heart. The conduction system of the heart includes the sinoatrial node or the SA node. It is also called the pacemaker of the heart, the atrioventricular node, the atrioventricular bundle, and right and left bundle branches, and the Purkinje fiber. All the cells of the conduction system can produce spontaneous action potential, but the sinoatrial node can produce the action potential much faster than any cell in the heart. In a case that the sinoatrial node is incompetent or not functioning, the atrioventricular node becomes the pacemaker of the heart. The sinoatrial node or the SA node is found in the right atrium. It is where the action potential originates and it functions as a pacemaker of the heart. It has a large number of calcium channels, and this is the reason why they conduct the action potential at a much faster rate. So the atrioventricular node is where the action potential goes after the sinoatrial node. So it is located in the lower portion of the right atrium, and it has a slower rate of action potential conduction that allows the atria to complete their contraction before action potentials are delivered to the ventricle. After the atrioventricular node, the action potential will then travel to the atrioventricular bundle. The AV bundle divides into left and right bundle branches. After the left and right bundle branches, it will then go to the Purkinje fiber. So it is found at the tip of the left and right bundle branches. So the Purkinje fiber pass to the apex of the heart and then extend to the cardiac muscle of the ventricle wall. Action potentials are rapidly delivered to all the cardiac muscles of the ventricle. Purkinje fiber is different from the Purkinje cell of the brain. And do note that ventricle has a thicker muscle than your atrium. Again, the action potential conduction starts with the SA node or the sinoatrial node, and then the AV node to the AV bundle or the atrioventricular bundle, and then the right and left bundle branches to your Purkinje fiber in the apex of your heart. So why do we have to study the action potential conduction in the heart? This is because the electrical current that it produces can be measured at the surface of the body through the electrocardiogram or the ECG or the EKG. The ECG is divided into three. We have the P waves, the QRS complex, and the T wave. The P wave results from the depolarization of the atrial myocardium, and the beginning of the P wave precedes the onset of an atrial contraction, meaning the blood pressure is on the atria and will then contract so that the blood will be pushed to your ventricle. The QRS complex consists of three individual waves, which are the Q, R, and the S waves. The QRS complex results from the depolarization of the ventricle, and the beginning of the QRS complex precedes ventricular contraction, meaning the blood will now be ready to be pushed through the semilunar valve of the pulmonary trunk. The T wave represents repolarization of the ventricles, and the beginning of the T wave precedes the ventricular relaxation. Note that the wave representing the repolarization of the atria cannot be seen because it occurs during the QRS complex. The time between the beginning of the P wave and the beginning of the QRS complex is the PQ interval, commonly called as the PR interval because the Q wave is very small. A cardiac cycle is a summative description of all the events that occur during one single heartbeat. Two terms that we have to study is the systole and diastole. When we say systole, it is contraction. And when we say diastole, it is relaxation. So the cardiac cycle is divided into four: the atrial systole, ventricular systole, atrial diastole, and ventricular diastole. The heart sound produces two types of sounds. So this sound is due to the closing of the semilunar valves. So a stethoscope is used to hear the heart sound. The first heart sound makes a lub sound, while the second heart sound makes the duck sound. The first heart sound is due to the closure of the atrioventricular valves, while the second heart sound is due to the closure of the semilunar valves. Here are some important values of the heart function that you must remember. First is the stroke volume, which is the volume of the blood pumped per ventricle per contraction, and the normal value is 70 milliliters per beat. Next is the heart rate. It is the number of heartbeats in 1 minute. The normal value is 72 beats per minute. Next is the cardiac output. This is the volume of the blood pumped by the ventricle in 1 minute. So, the normal value is 5 liters per minute. Cardiac output is computed by multiplying your stroke volume and your heart rate. Our heart has two regulatory mechanisms. First is the intrinsic, and second is the extrinsic. So the intrinsic regulation refers to the mechanism contained within the heart itself that control the cardiac output. So we have the preload and afterload. The preload is the degree of ventricular walls are stretched at the end of the diastole, while the afterload is the pressure against which ventricle must pump the blood. The extrinsic regulation mechanism is divided into two. We have the baroreceptor reflex and the chemoreceptor reflex. So what is extrinsic regulation? It refers to the mechanism of external that is external to the heart, such as either nervous or chemical regulation. There are a lot of heart disease. These are the example of those heart diseases. One is the coronary artery disease. This is due to the decreased blood supply to the heart. Coronary arteries are narrowed for some reason. Next is the myocardial infarction, or most commonly known as the heart attack. These are the example of heart procedure that can be performed in heart diseases. One is angioplasty, which is a procedure that opens the blocked blood vessels. Stent, which is the structure inserted to keep the vessel open. The bypass, which is a procedure that reroutes blood away from the blocked artery. This is all for chapter 12. I hope you learned. Thank you.